This afternoon, April Glaspie, former United States ambassador to Iraq, was on Capitol Hill, second day of questioning on diplomatic contacts with Iraqi leading up to the August 2nd invasion of Kuwait. She was also questioned about a classified cable she sent back to Washington at the conclusion of that meeting. Ambassador Glaspie is a career foreign service having spent the last 25 years in the diplomatic corps. She has served posts as political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, director of the Language Institute at the Embassy in Tunis, and deputy chief in Damascus. She has also been director of the Office of Jordan, Lebanon, and Syrian Affairs in Washington. Ms. Glaspie was confirmed as ambassador to Baghdad in March of 1988.
The meeting of the subcommittee will come to order. Subcommittee on Europe and Middle East meets open session today to hear testimony from the Honorable April Glaspie, United States Ambassador to the Republic of Iraq.
But he had already, on the 25th of July, got himself a higher oil price at that OPEC meeting. So the UAE was the other overproducing country, and that is why the UAE was picked out.
Was anything said to you about, in this context, about Saudi Arabia? Did he or any of his ministers ever mention Saudi Arabia with regard to overproduction or
no, sir.
Complaints?
Not overproduction, no.
Or Turkey?
No.
I met with, I and others met with President Mubarak in December, and he said, and that was after, of course, we had substantial troops in the area and they were building up and so on, right before the United Nations vote on the use of force. But it was fairly apparent that was going to happen then. And President Mubarak made the statement that Saddam Hussein did not realize what he was up against, and that no one would give him bad news for obvious and rather deadly reasons.
Yes.
He also mentioned something that I thought was very interesting, that he said he repeated, of course, his story that Saddam Hussein had lied to him about his intentions to invade. He said he would not, and he did. And he also said that the Kuwaitis had offered him everything that he had demanded except a different border. Is that your impression too?
That was not my impression. I have never seen a full account, entirely credible account of that famous meeting in Jeddah. Clearly there was no conclusion to the negotiations, since it was announced by both sides that they were going in the next few days to reconvene in Baghdad. I had understood that the Kuwaitis had hung tough on a number of the financial requests that were made to them in Jeddah.
When Saddam Hussein was criticizing you and our government for our activities in the Gulf, the fleet and so on, and you were telling him we were going to defend our vital interests, did he refer at all to anything like internal divisions in this country or the role of Congress or anything of that kind? He certainly did later after the troops were built up.
He may have. He was certainly thinking it. The foreign minister often spoke about it. The key passage, I think, in my conversation with him on that day was, and this is in the transcript, the business about the 10,000 deaths. You Americans couldn't stomach heavy casualties.
He did say that.
He did. He did. This was his idea of Vietnam. He I think he believed that the Vietnamese were not a worthy opponent, and if the Vietnamese could create political waves in the United States, he was certainly as smart as they were. That was the sense I got.
Well, I certainly would not join those who apparently are now criticizing you for not saying we would go to war, because the president himself couldn't do that without at least talking to Congress about it, and there was plenty of division in Congress right up until the vote we had. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Oh, sorry. Okay, Mr. Gallagher had a question.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I know we have a vote on, so Ambassador Glaspie, I have one quick question. It will kind of deter a little bit from the post-mortem, and I would really like to hear you express your views as to the strength of the opposition groups in Iraq today, and how you see the potential for their success in overthrowing Saddam Hussein, or at least his regime.
Well, in the north, of course, you can certainly talk about opposition groups. The Kurds have been organized in various political parties for a long time, a number of years. Masoud Barzani is certainly the military commander and has taken military command in the field. And there are a number of parties that you, I'm sure, are aware of, the Kurdish Democratic Party, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The South, of course, is an entirely different thing. This appears to be have originated as entirely spontaneous uprisings in these various towns and in the city of Basra. What organization is taking place there right now, coming from the Iranian side of the border, is very difficult to detect. Historically, whenever the borders have been open for any reason whatsoever, and clearly they're open for a very unusual reason now, Iranian organizers have come over, or they have sent Iraqi Shia agents of a very radical Islamic view over to do their organizing. I don't know how many are there, but I think we have to assume that some are. I cannot, I have no intelligence that they are there, but I think it's reasonable to assume they are. Our own view, of course, is that we hope the Iraqi people will sooner rather than later have a chance to organize their own participatory democracy. And we feel very strongly, of course, that Iraq must remain as a territorial unity in the area. I hope that helps.
What is your assessment of the opposition, individually or collectively, causing the personal demise of Saddam Hussein?
It's a very difficult call to make, and our own analysts are being extremely careful, and I don't blame them. It is possible that the fighting in the South will go on and on. It is going on, or was going on this morning. Although they have, the Army has, of course, armor down there, and heaven knows what else, they haven't been able to stamp it out. It keeps popping up. The North is a very different issue. Of course, there have been long periods in the history of modern Iraq when the North was not in any way under the sway of Baghdad. But if the central government can't control the North, and if they lose Mosul and Kirkuk, then I think this central government's days simply must be numbered. If he hangs on, then I would think that the importance of holding on to sanctions becomes critical, because the economic pinch, I think, would begin to be very important. On that point, I would like to emphasize that the President's view is very strong, that we want nothing that we do to contribute to the tragic suffering of the Iraqi people, and we will be working with the ICRC and the UN and so on to see what we can do to send food and medicine in particular to alleviate their suffering.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. The subcommittee will resume its sitting. Mr. Leach.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Glaspie. It strikes me that when we review all of this, that we've put a lot of attention to the fact that maybe we misjudged Saddam, but at the heart of it was our misjudgment about his misjudgment about the United States. Yeah. And yesterday you used the phrase or the adjective stupid in implying to his judgment. But it strikes me that Saddam concluded, perhaps based on his references, as I understand it, to Americans and others about the Iran Gate affair and the Iran episode in particular, that perhaps we were coercible. And the reason I say this is that it strikes me that as we look at the Bush administration record, which basically is one of warning through action, that is through maneuvers with a very small Gulf state, as well as with statements about that we would not tolerate aggressive action, that he must have concluded that we didn't mean particularly what we meant. And so I'm wondering if you would like to contemplate about the kind of the historical background in terms of how you assess Saddam and whether you think the whole Iran episode was part of his calculations about the United States.
I think that Saddam, who was first burst onto the political scene as a young man, and the attempted, the man literally who undertook to assassinate the president of Iraq and then had to flee the country and spent some years in exile studying. I have been told that the thing that interested him, I'm sure among many things, but the one thing that interested him very much was how do you get into power if you're somebody from a small village and no connections, and how do you hold on to that power? It is said that he studied, for example, the life of Stalin, not, of course, because he was a communist, rabidly anti-communist, but of course the typical interest that one has in how did a country boy move up through the party and then somehow get hold of the military and civilian intelligence organs so as to be able to maintain himself in power. I think that that task, which he set himself, was all-consuming for most of his political career. It took him a long time to get into that position and to consolidate
but the
it.
question I'm interested in is not this past, but how we looked at the United States. Did the Iran episode have a formative influence on it?
Well, the short answer to that is it had a traumatic effect on the Iraqi government. They thought they understood what our policy was, and it certainly wasn't hostile to Iraq. It was hostile to Iran, the Khomeini government in Iran. The Iran Gate episode, as I said yesterday, the Iraqis believe that the United States literally gave their order of battle to the Iranians. It was absolutely traumatic. And it was one of the few issues where there was a grassroots resonance in the country.
But what I'm getting at, and the reason I'm raising this, because I don't think you understand, because I'm being a little oblique, is that it strikes me that as we look back on the Iran episode, that the United States appeared to be coerced by the hostage-taking. We appeared to be...
Oh, I'm sorry. We were in a different Iran episode.
And the reason I raise this again is that it strikes me that under the Bush administration, policy was fairly consistent, was fairly principled. One can argue whether or not we should have imposed sanctions or not in a firmer, earlier way. But the fact is that from the Iraqi perspective, they were looking at an America that seemed a little bit flabby in our foreign policy will.
Yes.
And again, the reason I raise this is not to suggest that the decision-making by Saddam Hussein was influenced by Jimmy Carter. I think that would be a little ridiculous. But simply to say that for those that think that an episode in which one meeting of an American ambassador with the head of state was a determinative kind of decision-making around which a head of state then made a decision to invade another country, that stretches credulity. That it strikes me that our record in that part of the world, stretching back more than a decade, was not one of as great firmness as the Bush administration has subsequently reversed. And I just raise this as strongly as I can because it may be April and March in this committee, but up is not down in foreign policy. And the fact of the matter is that the people that would latch on to a single meeting between a United States ambassador and a head of state and then suggest somehow that we're responsible for precipitating a conflict, or those critics in the Mideast who think that we, in effect, attempted to seduce him in so that we could then have a ground presence in the region, and there are those that argue that, I think are profoundly misled. And that was the reason for suggesting that line of inquiry. Now, I don't know if you'd want to respond just briefly on that. My time has expired.
You're absolutely right. And the Iraqi press from time to time did recall, for the edification of its readers, the Iran hostage episode.
Certainly all of the aspects of taking hostages and thinking our policy would then be held hostage.
Absolutely.
Implies that was a great influence on this.
Oh, yes. Saddam Hussein is somebody who likes to learn from history, and he thought he had learned something.
Sure. Well, all I would say is, I mean, at the risk of the greatest presumption that somehow, sometimes people in politics attempt to assert accountabilities that I think get exaggerated, and that doesn't mean that the exact opposite is the case either, that the other party is responsible either. But I would certainly personally believe that the United States government's handling of the Iran hostage episode had more to do with Saddam's decision to invade Iraq than any conceivable meeting of the United States diplomat at any particular period of time.
And then a second serious miscalculation, taking his own hostages.
Yes. Thank you.
Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Madam Ambassador. Let me say, firstly, that I've been a strong supporter of the President's policies since August 2nd, having voted on January 12th to allow the President to take any means necessary to force Iraq out of Kuwait. But there are a few things that really boggle my mind. Earlier on, you said in your testimony that you believed that Saddam Hussein was convinced that we were hostile to him and we were trying to subvert his government, and that nothing, essentially, I think that was the thrust of what you had said, that we would do or could do would make him believe otherwise. Mr. Lantos and some of the other members have pointed out that many in Congress were arguing for months and indeed years that Saddam was not going to change and that we should have taken a firmer policy with him. In fact, the bill that came out of this committee on August the 1st, the day before he invaded, was a sanctions bill. And the State Department had called the sponsor of that bill on that day many, many times, trying to get him to modify it and withdraw it and everything else. It would seem to me, how do you reconcile this? If no matter what we did would convince him that we were his friends, then why did we seemingly try to appease him for so long?
I would like to take you back to the origin of the policy, which of course is the origin of this short historical period from August 1988, the end of the Gulf War. As I said before, he was there, a powerful country in a strategic spot. We could try to work with him. We could try to moderate his views of the area. It didn't mean that we accepted the views of some of our friends in the region who said he was a changed man and was already a moderate simply because he wanted to form an Arab Cooperation Council and he announced to sign non-aggression pacts with all his neighbors. I don't think many of his neighbors believed that he was not aggressive. That wasn't it at all. The point was he was there. I don't mean to be oversimplistic, and I hope that you won't think I am, but I believe that there were two general categories of policy action before us at that point. We could have tried to teach him a lesson in general, to isolate him, give up the opportunity of access to decision makers in the government, if not to him, but certainly to decision makers in the government, to ameliorate his policies or to soften his policies abroad, and perhaps in a way that Americans feel important, to do something for the especially minority Iraqi communities who were living there. We chose to do that. Appeasement. The tone of my 2 years of dialogue with the Iraqis was not seen by them as appeasement. I uttered words like inflammatory and abysmal and unacceptable more times in those 2 years than I hope ever to have to do again. The substance of what we were talking about was certainly not appeasement. We had an agenda, and we told them about it. Human rights was very high. I spent, I would say, the majority of my conversations in Iraq were on human rights issues of one kind or another. I mentioned the Stark, which was very important to our government and to the 37 families involved. Am I responding at all to your concerns?
Yes, but it seems to me, how could we have hoped to moderate his views if in fact he was convinced that we were hostile to him and there was nothing we could do to change that?
No, we weren't convinced there was nothing that we could do to change it. We were convinced, on the contrary, that we should try cautiously. We should not open the gates of the bank to him. There was very few things we should do, but we should not give up, apply sanctions, tell him unless he behaved, we wouldn't talk to him again, and go home, which is the effect of a sanctions policy. And I've never understood a sanctions policy which will not make the victim of it change their policy. He had lots of money from oil revenue. If we decided we wouldn't sell him grommets, he was going to get them somewhere else. He wanted to buy military equipment, of course, from us, which we didn't allow him to do. Sorry?
Well, you see, it just seems to some of us that if that's the attitude that we take, that an individual sanctions policy wouldn't work, then why was Syria, our erstwhile ally, on a list of countries that export terrorism, and therefore we had lots of sanctions against Syria, and when many of us saw virtually no difference between Iraq and Syria in the events leading up to the invasion?
Well, the difference, of course, was the criteria for the terrorism list. The Syrians are actively supporting, as you recall, particular terrorists. The Iraqis had thrown them out. They went to Syria directly. Abu Nidal got on his bicycle and drove across the border and sat down. And poor Ambassador Eagleton, who had spent 4 years, I think, getting him out of Iraq, was then assigned to Syria. And there he was again. I showed him on the way from the airport. There's Abu Nidal's house. He almost resigned on the spot. But he got him out of Syria, ultimately.
We obviously didn't think or weren't sure whether or not Saddam Hussein would invade Kuwait. I'm told that Israeli intelligence was telling us that he would. The Egyptians said that he wouldn't. To what extent was our policy toward Iraq influenced during this period of time by what other Arab countries were telling us about Saddam Hussein?
Not at all. As I've tried to explain, Arab countries were saying to us and in public that they did not believe that the United States should get involved at all. They thought that this was an Arab issue, that advice from us would be provocative to him, and the worst thing we could do was flex our muscles.
Why do you think that if there was certainly a chance that Saddam Hussein was going to invade Kuwait, even if we were getting conflicting signals in different quarters, why would we not then get our American citizens out of Kuwait prior to the possibility of the invasion? Why did we not evacuate our people in both Kuwait and Iraq?
For the American ambassador in Kuwait to determine that American citizens should leave, and of course he cannot order American citizens to leave, as you know, is of course a major decision. What the ambassador did was keep the American colony, which was huge, in Kuwait, well informed, about the embassy's concerns. He had a warden system which worked. In Baghdad, of course, we had a tiny American community, and I could practically call them all in half an hour, so it wasn't that kind of a problem in Baghdad. Newspapers. And, you know, there really was news. You assume, after all, that American citizens who are working for a major oil company in Kuwait are people who you know what they've come into. But the warden system in Kuwait was tested and activated, and the ambassador was using his best judgment. Now, you know, Washington, which is responsible for providing intelligence estimates, did not come to the conclusion that Iraq was going to invade. We made a mistake, Congressman, and there were other mistakes that flowed from it. Had we had the smoking gun, we would have been able to persuade the Arabs and the Soviets and our Western allies to form a coalition before the invasion. But we didn't, and that wasn't an intelligence failure, because the smoking gun, so to speak, the evidence that he was going to do it, was a decision that he had made clearly in his mind. We do have some evidence that he didn't even inform his military commanders of it until a very few hours before the move.
Well, we're told that July 25th, the CIA had come to the strong conclusion that he was going to invade.
Well, Congressman, you know I can't discuss intelligence issues.
Might I just, one final thing, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gallagher had asked a question about what now. I'm wondering, with your assessment, having been there for 2 years, what do you feel are the chances of someone within the Ba'ath Party or Saddam's inner circle toppling him? I feel very incomplete. We had such a tremendous victory, but somehow this man is still sitting there in Baghdad.
If that were to happen, and it could be a very grim figure indeed, it could be, for example, this man who is so well known in Kurdistan and who was then exported to do the same evil deeds in Kuwait, and then was appointed Minister of Interior recently, so that there'd be no question about what would happen to the Shia if they didn't stop their insurrection. It could indeed be somebody like that. I think the silver lining there, Congressman, would be that it would definitely be an interim government. I do not believe somebody who lacks Saddam Hussein's organizational abilities, which he certainly has, unfortunately, would hang on.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I do think the most likely thing, of course, is a military commander.
Second bells have rung. Mr. Faleo-Mavega, do you want to begin your questions? The Chair would be glad to have you do it. We'll follow whatever...
if there's no problem with that, Mr. Chairman.
No problem at all. We recognize the gentleman from American Samoa, and the Chair will vacate here in order to vote, and I'll get back as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Proceed.
I would like to, first of all, compliment you, Madam Ambassador, and to personally welcome you before the subcommittee or before this committee. And I want to compliment your sincerity and the forthrightness of your responses to the questions, not only before this committee, but certainly most of us who've had the opportunity of witnessing your responses to before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I also want to state for the record that I agree entirely with Chairman Fassel's observations of the fact that the way that you were treated, and in my humble opinion, you were treated quite shabbily by your superiors. And to note also for the record that you certainly have a very distinguished career. I had just returned yesterday from the Persian Gulf, and to affirm that from your colleagues and those who are still there, sharing with you also the fact that it was not a very pleasant experience for me, to say the least. Reminiscing also of my own personal experiences in Vietnam, but very proud of the fact that certainly our nation's military capability, without question, second to none, the best in the world. But cautioning that observation and saying that hopefully a humbling responsibility for our nation, and that when we release such awesome capability and the capacity to kill other human beings, I know that this is not the intent of our country, nor is it ever our policy. It's a very interesting situation of the fact that while we were able to resolve one problem, we are now faced with 2 or 3 more problems in this very tensive area of the world. We've accomplished our military mission. And one thing that I find quite amusing is that over this entire period, we have never had so many overnight experts on the Middle East issue. And I just want to say that I am certainly no expert on this very sensitive issue that has never been able to resolve. So here again, we are now groping for solutions to issues that were considered supposedly politically and diplomatically impossible to resolve. And it just saddens me that it's somewhat of a sad commentary of a poorly structured foreign policy in Vietnam as an example, and that our men and women who returned from that terrible conflict were treated without honor and dignity by our own citizens. And I make this observation that the Persian Gulf War is not a redemption of Vietnam, but a constant reminder that half-baked wars have always gotten us into trouble. And perhaps in my humble observations, the serious question now is that perhaps we have not gone far enough in putting Saddam in its rightful place, because the problem still exists. I have a couple of questions. Hopefully, if you could help me, as you have partially responded by saying that the 2-year period that you served as ambassador to Iraq, that you actually had not had that many direct communications with Saddam Hussein. But I was under the impression that you, more than any other public official, in the person of the president, as ambassador and as representative of our country, would know more than anyone concerning the leader of this country. Madam Ambassador, is it true that Saddam Hussein, to a great extent, had access to KGB or intelligence information before, during, and after all that has happened in the Persian Gulf War? Perhaps could this have been an incentive for him to feel encouraged that the kind of information that he was given made him comfortable to think that he was able to overcome potentially militarily any sense of our response militarily to the actions that he had taken by invading Kuwait?
Congressman, I honestly don't know the answer to your question about the intelligence that he had at his disposal. I think that probably one of the most misleading factors in the set of factors that he thought that he had presented to him was that I believe the people around him are sycophants and wanted to show him that they had made great technological strides. You recall that we had a kind of moon missile which was announced with great fanfare as the first Arab missile, which turned out, I think, to be 4 scuds with a rope around them. This kind of thing, I'm sure, was presented to him constantly, together with the analysis that having dealt with, quote, American technology, unquote, in the Iranian inventory, they could deal with it again directly when it was employed by us. It sounds very naive, but I do think that that might have been part of the thinking.
Madam Ambassador, is it true that approximately 2 weeks before the invasion, through the Israeli intelligence and the community in that area, that we were warned Iraq is going to invade, Iraq is going to invade, and yet we paid no attention to these warnings? Is there any truth to this allegation?
I have no idea, sir. This would be something that wouldn't swim into my ken. I'm not aware of such a warning.
Is it your position then that how was our own intelligence surveillance in not recognizing that when you have 100,000 troops on the border of Kuwait, still there was no symptoms in saying that this guy is really serious, that he's going to invade? Of course, he made these allegations to the other leaders that he's not going to do so.
I think when you say intelligence, you're talking about my brain power, and I agree with you. It's pretty low level that day. As far as intelligence information is concerned, we had all we needed. As I said to the Senate committee, we didn't need any help from unmentionable machines. It was all there. We could see it and we could hear it. We drew the wrong conclusions from it. So it's a different kind of intelligence that was lacking.
So we just had absolutely no information whatsoever to the fact that this man was going to invade Kuwait. We did not in any way know for sure.
If we had that kind of evidence, what we would have tried to have done in the most energetic manner conceivable would have been to create the coalition that we were only able to create after he actually did it. The Arabs did not believe he was going to invade, and they didn't want us to do much to try to help. They felt the only way to prevent, to draw him into the negotiations that everybody wanted him to begin seriously, was to set up an Arab negotiating framework and invite him to it. He went, clearly part of the deception.
Do you suppose that the position or the proposition that perhaps that we had misjudged his actions?
Well, we clearly came to the wrong conclusions, Congressman. As I mentioned before, we thought that since first he was getting what he said he wanted, or seemed to be about to get what he said he wanted, both in terms of oil prices and a, quote, Marshall Plan, unquote, Arab Marshall Plan for himself, and the cancellation, formal cancellation of his war debts to the Arab countries, that, these appeared to be his short-term aims. Second, there was a mindset in the area. Now here I don't mean to cast aspersions. I don't think we held it, but I think the Arabs held it, that if he did anything further to bully and intimidate, perhaps as a background to the negotiations that they hoped he was going to begin, it would be yet another in a long series of incursions that Iraq had made since 1963, or even one, since Kuwaiti independence. And there'd been a number of them, some very flagrant ones, in 73, a well-known one, for instance, and I think, as I mentioned yesterday, a less well-known one about a year before August the 2nd. So it was true that Arabs talked about this as a possibility, but after the 25th, King Fahd and President Mubarak felt that they had a commitment that would not be broken.
One more question. One very serious concern that that I was given, and at least this is something I'm sure that everybody's aware of, the fact that Syria has recently purchased several Scud missiles from North Korea, and that the reality that we now are faced with in the Middle East, that now Syria and Iran are the most destabilizing forces now in play in the Persian Gulf. Where do we go from here?
It's very tempting for me to answer that question, Congressman. I'd like to offer you my views, but I think that I'm really not the person to ask. I'm assured that the Secretary of State will be appearing before this committee right after the Easter break. I think he's the one that knows the answer.
Your expertise is in the Middle East, is it not, Madam Ambassador?
Yes, it is.
Why is it, and this is something that it just strikes me as awfully funny, that I met with one of the career Foreign Service officers who has a doctorate in Chinese history.
Ah, you met my consul, Melvin Ang.
Is fluent in Mandarin, Cantonese, and Hakka, and he's assigned to the Middle East.
It was his choice.
Well, no. But the point is, it blows my mind that here's someone who specializes in Asia-Pacific issues that can really make a real contribution to our country, but knows, I mean, has he gone through 5 years of training and understanding and appreciating Middle Eastern issues and problems?
He's a very fine Foreign Service officer, Congressman. I think he'll make a real...
Please, don't.
No, I think he'll make a real contribution wherever he is.
No, that's not the point.
I know.
The point I'm making is that how can we do something like this? It's just like if I were to go to a university. If I want to get to understand more about the Middle East, would I be studying Arabic? Chinese? If I were to become, I just am a little confused on how you move personnel within the State Department when they are not, they don't have the necessary tools to work within that. And this is not in any way disparaging against this gentleman, whom I have the highest respect for. But just as an observation, I know you can't respond to this, and Mr. Chairman, I know my time is up. Thank you very much.
Mr. Solars.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. April, you and I go back way together. I think we met for the first time almost 17 years ago to the week in Cairo during the course of my very first trip abroad as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, when you were assigned to me as my control officer.
I didn't do very well controlling you either, Congressman.
And I have watched your career with considerable interest over the years, and even though I had little to do with your advancement, I must say I took a certain amount of pride in it, because I was tremendously impressed with you at the time, and I always thought you were one of the best and the brightest in the Foreign Service. And in a way, it was precisely for these reasons that I was so dismayed when I read the transcript that Iraq released of your meeting with Saddam Hussein, particularly when the State Department, by refusing or failing to issue any denials as to its veracity, appeared to lend a kind of implicit legitimacy to that account. And so I hope you'll understand if I fulfill my institutional responsibilities by asking you some questions about it. First of all, I'd like to know, did they make a videotape of that meeting?
Oh, they may well have, but the camera was hidden.
Okay, so you didn't see one?
No.
Okay. Who was your note taker for the meeting?
Since I had been invited to come back to the Foreign Ministry for what I assumed was just a resumed session with the Deputy Foreign Minister, I didn't have a note taker with me. We had a very small embassy. Everybody's very busy.
So the cable that you subsequently sent back, you wrote or dictated from your memory of the meeting?
I did.
Did you take notes during the course of it?
As you know, we are perhaps immodest enough to believe that after 25 years of training, we can remember. In my case, I was lucky because it was broken by the President Mubarak telephone call, so I had plenty of time to take notes during the meeting.
Okay. Now, on July 25th, when the meeting took place, had you been apprised of the fact that they had deployed 100,000 troops along the Kuwaiti border?
I don't recall, frankly, Congressman, what our count was at that time, but it was certainly a high count, yes.
But you knew they had deployed forces along the...
Oh, yes, of course.
Now, after you returned to Washington, and following the release by Iraq of their version of this discussion, were you explicitly instructed by the department to say nothing about it, to neither confirm nor deny, as it were, the veracity of their version of the discussion?
I don't believe I was explicitly instructed not to say anything. It was explained that a decision had been made that it would be unwise for the department, of which obviously I am a member, to argue about it in public at that time. That a point-by-point rebuttal would focus our national energies where we should not be focusing them, that the time for that would come later.
So you felt that it was the view of the department that it would be best for you to say nothing about it?
Indeed, as the department indeed itself said.
Right. Would you object now to having that cable turned over to the Foreign Affairs Committee on a classified basis if necessary so that we could take a look at it?
Yes, sir, I would, for what I think is an absolutely compelling reason. I said yesterday, and I will say again today, that in my 25 years in diplomacy, I have not been personally aware of a case where any government, no matter what the temptation, has issued such a transcript other than Saddam Hussein's government. And the reason, of course, is credibility and the ability of a government to obtain confidential information, if you will, discreetly. Once you start issuing memoranda of conversation with chiefs of state, I think it damages the confidentiality of a very, very important process. So personally, no. Professionally, emphatically, yes.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that you personally have no objection to the cable being given to us. I have to say, professionally, I fundamentally disagree with your judgment. For one thing, this committee is frequently given access to cables involving discussions between ambassadors and foreign leaders, including heads of state. And secondly, to the extent that there is a legitimate concern about confidentiality, that could presumably be protected if the cable were provided on a classified basis. And we see all sorts of communications that come back from our embassies abroad, including conversations with foreign leaders. So it would hardly be unprecedented if that cable were turned over to this committee, and I hope the chairman at some point will consider the possibility of issuing a subpoena to obtain the cable in the event it's not possible to get through more friendly means, because I certainly don't think this should be, at this point, any kind of an adversarial proceeding. We've just emerged from one of the greatest triumphs in our history, and those who participated in organizing it certainly deserve a lot of credit. Now, let me move on. You said that the reason for not issuing a denial of the veracity of that transcript at the time was because we had to concentrate on building the coalition, and we didn't want to focus attention on what had happened previously when there were more important tasks at hand. But I have to tell you, Madam Ambassador, that I find that explanation inherently implausible. And I find it inherently implausible because, in fact, the Iraqi version of the discussion was compromising our capacity to muster support for the President's policy here at home. It contributed to the view that we were somehow or other responsible for what had happened by giving Saddam the impression that he could get away with what he had done. And consequently, in terms of mustering and maintaining American support for a policy of firmness in the Gulf, I don't understand why it wouldn't have made sense for the department or for you to have issued a statement that this is fundamentally misleading, a classic exercise in disinformation, and possibly through the selective use of statements you had made to him, making it clear that the Iraqi version was, in fact, distorted. That would have contributed to American support and therefore to the effort to pull together a coalition. So could you perhaps respond to that? Because on the face of it, it just does seem inherently implausible.
I have provided to you the logic and the conclusion that the department employed. Mr. Scholars, I can't make any other response.
Okay. Well, let me ask you then very briefly about some of the other statements in this transcript. One of the most troublesome comments or lack of comments in the Iraqi version, and I hope you'll take advantage of this opportunity to clear it up if it can be cleared up, was Saddam's statement in which he says at the beginning, "But you know that you did not protect your friends during the war with Iran." And then he goes on to say, "I say this because of the nature of the geography and the nature of American society, which makes it impossible for the United States to bear tens of thousands of casualties in one battle." Now, at a time when a man has mobilized 100,000 troops along the border of a friendly state, this is a very, very serious statement. And according to the Iraqi version of the transcript, there doesn't seem to have been any instance in which you attempted to rebut this assertion or to say to Saddam that you represented a country which values human life, but which has paid the price in the past for defending its vital interests and the freedom of its friends, and would be prepared to do so again in the future. So I guess my question to you is, did he in fact make this statement, and did you in fact at some appropriate point attempt to indicate to him the error of his ways?
Yes, he made it. It is a statement that was often made in Baghdad. It had been made to me on more than one occasion, and in the foreign ministry. I had always in the past responded to it in various different ways, of course. It had also appeared in the Iraqi-controlled press. It was a very common misapprehension about us. It is one of the points I did not respond to when I was speaking to Saddam Hussein. He made a long list of points, many of which are in that transcript. I was, I would say, about 1/4 down the list of responses when he left the room, went to speak to the President of Egypt, and came back and, in effect, said, we're not going to do it, it's all over. I responded then, as I recall, to a couple of particularly egregious comments that he had made. I didn't want to leave without saying a word about them. In particular, the Tutwiler statement. I responded to that, so there's no question about that. He said, I want you basically to leave. That is, Congressman, one of several points that I certainly had wanted to discuss with him. It is also one of the reasons that I saw the foreign minister. I wanted to respond to all the issues that I had not responded to with the President.
And when you saw, did you see the foreign minister?
On the 28th.
And did you respond to that precise point when you met with the foreign minister?
I responded to the precise point. Whether or not I referred to the 10,000, I don't remember, but I certainly responded to the point of assuming a softness in the American character, which I was hearing over and over again, and including from the President, okay, and which I thought had been influenced in part by a complete misreading of the contemporary history of the United States.
Now, it also says here in this Iraqi transcript that that you said that you mentioned the program that was broadcast on VOA.
Yes.
It was unfortunate, and we have offered formal apologies concerning this matter. Now, I have this editorial before me, "No More Secret Police." I have to say, for the life of me, I don't see a single word or sentence in here that is unfortunate. This is a statement of the most fundamental American values. It deplores the existence of secret police and regimes which depend on their brutality to remain in power. And I suppose in the part you might have had in mind, it says secret police are also entrenched in other countries, not just the Soviet Union and East Germany, such as China, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Cuba, and Albania. The rulers of these countries hold power by force and fear, not by the consent of the governed. But as the East Europeans demonstrated in 1989, the tide of history is against such rulers. Now,
that's not complete, excuse me.
Yeah.
There was yet another line.
The 1990s should belong not to the dictators and secret police, yes, but to the people.
Yes.
Now, could you tell me what, if anything, was unfortunate about that editorial?
Absolutely. The editorial, except for those last lines that you just wrote, was of course entirely appropriate, and as you described, and it was written for a broadcast on Eastern European services of the Voice of America, and was so used, and I am sure quite effectively. The lines at the end were added for the Arabic broadcast. I don't know if it was also broadcast later in Spanish and Albanian and Chinese. But the fact is that it does give rise to the possibility of misinterpretation that we are calling on the people of those 6, countries to overthrow their governments. Whatever views the United States government may have of other governments in the world, it is emphatically not engaged in subverting the regimes. I think we have a very fundamental, and I'm surprised at you, Congressman, I think we have a very fundamental division on this. I certainly think it gives rise to serious misinterpretation. And if you are holding State Department cables in your hand, you will have seen the words that were cabled to me from Washington, and they were very carefully phrased.
Well, were you told to apologize for this, or instructed to apologize for it?
Yes, the words in the cable that you're reading.
Then let me say, I'm glad that's cleared up, because if that is the case, I certainly have absolutely no quarrel with you. But I must say...
Well, you should, Congressman, because if I hadn't been told, I would have asked to have been told.
Well, then,
I was trying to create some kind of influence for the United States of America in this very dangerous country, so that we could influence it and moderate it. And the major impediment to that was their belief that for 20 years we had been trying to subvert the regime. This was a serious handicap in the job that the President had given me to do.
this was not an editorial about Iraq. It was an editorial about repressive regimes in general. And we perhaps have an honest difference of opinion here, but I have to say that the sentence, the 1990s, should belong not to the dictators and secret police, but to the people, expresses exactly the sentiments of the American people. I would like to believe it expresses the sentiments of the administration. I think we should be and should have been utterly unapologetic about it. And if they were offended by it, the answer, I think, should have been, get rid of your secret police and let your people run the country, not the Muhabarat. Let me ask you finally, if I may, about one other comment in this Iraqi transcript, and I hope you can clear it up. You said, according to the transcript, I saw the Diane Sawyer program in which there were some unfair points. This is the way the media works in America, even when it affects American politicians. And you go on to say, if the American president could control the media, his job would be easier. Now, a little bit earlier, you said that Diane Sawyer did America proud in that interview. So perhaps you could tell us now if this is an accurate representation of what you said, and if it is, what did Diane Sawyer do that in your view was unfair, and what did you mean in telling the president of a country that doesn't have freedom of the press, in fact, excuse me, which executes journalists of foreign countries, that this is the way the media works in America, even when it affects American politics? I
would be delighted to answer that question. As I think you weren't here when I mentioned that we worked all through 1989 to get journalists in to see Saddam Hussein. Since diplomats couldn't see him, many of us hoped that by having journalists see him, he would begin to learn more than he knew about the outside world and the concerns, and the basis of the concerns about Iraq that were held in the outside world. The initial encounter that he had was, of course, a shock to him. He was hardly used to being cross-questioned by anybody, much less by a journalist. I wanted to say two things to him on this, having the opportunity to be in his presence. First, I wanted to get over to him that we regard editing of videotapes which are labeled as complete, as cheap and unjust, and we had noticed that he had authorized, presumably he authorizes everything in the country, exactly that as far as the videotapes which are being produced by the Ministry of Information. I did it, and I think he took the point by saying that the President of the United States, and I think I said Mrs. Thatcher, are constantly under the gun, if you will, of tough cross-questioning by journalists. This is the way we do it. If you want to get your story over the airwaves to the American people through the American journalists, you've got to put up with that. That was the point of my comments. As far as Diane Sawyer is concerned, I will say again, I did not in any way discuss Diane Sawyer's videotape. I was talking about the Iraqi Ministry of Information's videotape of the Diane Sawyer interview, which cut out all the footage, if that's the right word, which Diane Sawyer herself used. In other words, the controversial parts.
So you're saying when you said it was unfair, you were referring to their coverage of Diane Sawyer's interview, not to Diane Sawyer's interview itself.
And not just Diane Sawyer's interview, but all the transcripts or videotapes that they were putting out. We had much more than Diane Sawyer by then.
Well, Mr. Chairman, my time is up, and I have no further questions, but I simply want to say that I think the State Department, assuming that this Iraqi version was as fundamentally flawed as we've been told it was, is true, that it was so fundamentally flawed. I think the State Department did a very serious disservice to the President's own efforts to counter this exercise in disinformation, and also a fundamental disservice to Ambassador Glaspie, because I think that these kinds of points, if they had been cleared up earlier, and presumably they could have been cleared up without breaching diplomatic confidentiality, would certainly have avoided a situation in which, you know, a distinguished career Foreign Service officer was permitted for several months to have her reputation significantly impaired and impugned by virtue of an unrebutted transcript, which, if accepted at face value, did not put her in the most favorable light. So I'm glad you've had a chance to clarify this, and I hope and trust we can finally lay the whole matter to rest by obtaining a copy of the cable and then making it clear that there is such a fundamental contrast between the way they described it and what you say actually happened.
Mr. McCloskey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I welcome you, Ms. Glaspie, and want to say I'm not really on the subcommittee. I'm on the overall committee, and I'm just thankful to have the opportunity to talk with you at all. And it's been a long wait, but I realize what you've been through the last 2 days, particularly, and all the time, and have immense respect for you personally and professionally. And as I understand it, in my previous general reading, you surely must know as much about Iraq and most aspects of the Middle East as any American in the employ of the government. And people like you, Arabists, if you will, are very valuable, and I wish we had more like you in many ways, and gave them better recognition and career opportunities than we do. And I'd like to prey on you a little bit to try to give me some fairly forthright intellectual analysis as to nothing recriminatory in the history, but some of the prospects presently and for the future. Obviously, nothing you have said or would say today probably would imply or hint or substantively go to any significant criticism of the State Department. But obviously, we've had a tremendous and massive military victory. There's no doubt about that. We've had relatively few casualties, as tragic as they were. Only one Marine killed in combat in my district. Another Marine lost, and we're on this military pride right now. But I'm asking you as a diplomat, not just over here as a State Department representative today, have we been diplomatically and politically successful? I just throw out a few of these observations. So obviously, Saddam Hussein has been chastened, but not destroyed. But thankfully, I guess his nuclear and chemical stockpiles are about gone, or will be. As I said, there's several hundred U.S. casualties. Who knows, but 80 to 100,000 Iraqi casualties, military and civilian. We've destroyed water lines. There's problems of nutrition and disease in that country. And I think most significantly, are we out of this war yet? I guess in all candor, wouldn't we have to say no? There's a three-way civil war going, at least, in which we are taking an active role by invoking a military force against various military alternatives that Saddam Hussein would have. We have 450,000 plus troops there. We had a Secretary of Defense yesterday say that there's going to be ongoing rotation back in. Kuwait has been ravaged. Even those who find the environmental disaster more or less acceptable or worthy of the price will admit that it is the biggest man-made ecological disaster in world history. The technical people tell us it's going to take 2 to 4 years to turn those off. The I guess en masse today or yesterday, in effect, the government of Kuwait resigned. People on the ground in Kuwait, unless we do something to help more than we are, probably have no immediate stability or sense of euphoria or happiness. Does this represent diplomatic and political success? And as to some of these variables that I mentioned right now, just where do we go from here? Can we fine-tune Iraq so much that we can have Saddam Hussein out and not have a Shiite fundamentalist regime expanding into a better part of that country? And then one last question, and I don't want to belabor this too much, but what could we have done to avoid all this?
Gosh. Well.
But I don't think I exaggerated on some of the aftermath of the war.
No, you didn't. I wish I had a teaspoon of sugar. This is a lot of serious questions that you've raised. I must, of course, say that these are exactly the questions that I'm sure you'll want to put to the Secretary. He's the one. But I can't resist making a couple of comments.
Good, I appreciate it.
Certainly on Kuwait, where I lived and where I still have many friends who, many of whom have called me over the last 7 months just to keep in touch, and I feel I am in touch with what's going on in Kuwait in a general way. I wouldn't underestimate the Kuwaitis' resilience. They're an extraordinary, tough people with a historic legacy of democratic government.
Would you say not an extraordinary tough?
They are an extraordinarily tough and resilient people.
Excuse me, Ms. Glaspie, did you just say a historic legacy of democratic government?
Yes, I do. I'm glad you were listening. It is. There is a.
Tell me about it. My understanding, the Emir abolished the assembly back in whatever it was, 62 or 68. As I understand it, it's a monarchy with strict control of the press. How can you call that a democracy?
I said an historical legacy of democracy. You're talking about a parliament. I'm not in any way denying what you're saying. What I want to say is something different. I want to say that when I lived there at the palace, which is on the water and which I gather is blown up by the Iraqis now, the Emir, not this Emir now, the previous one, sat in council once a week, and anybody could come and speak to him. This is a kind of democracy. It's homegrown. You have it in your constituency. People could come and speak to you. And I think this is real. Congressman, I think this is real. I'm not playing games here. I think this is real.
I don't think you are, but I think you're on the verge of a substantive and semantic mistake that makes me think of the only thing I can think of it on a national scale is poor President Ford talking about Poland being a democracy back in the campaign against Carter.
Congressman, please let me.
Wait a minute. You obviously know a lot about international diplomacy, but I don't think you know much about domestic constitutional politics and what is the definition of a democracy.
Congressman, please let me finish the sentence.
Runs a benevolent, or more or less benevolent monarchy, but I just find it mind-boggling. I'm sorry.
I started by saying don't sell the Kuwaitis short. As you pointed out, they are in a very difficult ecological and logistical position right now. I believe that they will develop some kind of participatory democracy. I didn't say they had one. I was going to say, I believe that they will develop some kind of participatory democracy, and that's what I was about to say, and they have something on which to draw. They have some traditions which are foreign to us, but which are not foreign to them. On Iraq, I don't think that we should be trying to do something which I think you implied is impossible, fine-tune.
I don't think it's impossible, but
no, you mentioned to try to fine-tune the.
It's exceedingly difficult to pull off, don't you think?
Absolutely.
And I appreciate your professional judgment on that.
Absolutely. I think it's impossible to pull off. I think that we should stick to basic principles. One of them is human rights principle that, as the President said, we don't want these planes up in the air dropping God knows what on Kurds, Kurdish civilians, or Arab civilians. There are a series of statements the President's made on that, and that's certainly a basic issue. A second basic issue is that other people should keep out of Iraq, and the President has talked about that as well. Beyond that, I don't think I would want to comment beyond what I had said earlier when I was asked for my opinion. And my opinion is what might happen is a military move of some kind. It would seem to me the most likely thing to happen. And I would like to close with what I hope is far more than a pious hope, and that is whatever the immediate aftermath of this may be on Iraqi politics, I sincerely hope that the Iraqi people, who are quite capable of it, will have the opportunity to participate in some kind of democratic structure.
As a professional diplomat in the Mideast, how do you feel about Assad coming out of this and Assad's present and future intentions?
Congressman, I really am going to decline to comment on Syrian politics. The Secretary will be here very soon, and he has just talked to President Assad.
But in essence, do you endorse an ongoing, an indefinite troop commitment in southern Iraq and the occasional military forays we have, which directly or indirectly, as you know, have the aspect of benefiting particular groups, which I know there's a good argument for, but is this? Would you recommend any improvements or slight marginal
Congressman,
nuances to improve
I really
this policy?
must decline to give the President advice through the.
Well, I'm asking for advice for the Congress, for the Foreign Affairs Committee, as we help shape the policy of this country and hopefully participate in a democratic way.
I think that's not for me to give. I would just remark that the President has said everybody's coming home.
Yeah, but you would agree that we have two countries substantially impaired with other problems going on right now.
Of course.
Yes.
Very serious problems.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Madam Ambassador, I know it's not your position, but I want to make sure the record is clear. This subcommittee, of course, would like to have the transcript of the total transcript of your conversation with President Saddam Hussein, and you understand our request.
I will convey that request.
If you'll convey that, I appreciate it. That's not your decision to make. We would also like to review the cables going back through 1990 and 1989. So I make that request as well, and would appreciate it if you would convey that.
I will do so.
It is also likely, when I finish my questions here, that we will even have additional questions, which we will want to submit in writing to the Department. Now, what I would like to do now is to go back through a series of incidents that occurred beginning in November 1989. And my only purpose here is to try to understand what happened and what we did as a result of that incident, to get the record straight. I want to start with a period in November of '89 when we in the Congress were considering a tank sale to Saudi Arabia. And in November 7th of 1989, one of the members of this subcommittee asked about the threat of Saudi Arabia. And the then Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Edward Ghanem, now our ambassador, as you know, to Kuwait, testified, "I don't think it is appropriate to focus on Iraq as the principal threat, because in truth, at the present time, Saudi-Iraqi relationships are good." That's the end of his quote. Then
they just signed a non-aggression pact, if I have my dates correct.
And Secretary Kelly replied later in November of that year, when he was asked about the state of the Saudi-Iraqi relationship, there is no doubt that the countries are on very good terms now. They have frequent visits with one another, cooperate on a number of fronts. So given the current relationship, it is hard for me to see Iraq as a threat to Saudi Arabia, end of quote. Now, was there any doubt in your mind at that time about the Iraqi-Saudi relationship, or do these statements fully express your view of that relationship at that time?
Well, there are levels and levels. Certainly, I would have made those statements myself.
You what?
I would have made such statements myself. That is what both governments professed. Both of them. They had chosen to sign a non-aggression pact and a security pact on the same day. But I would also have said, although no Arab diplomat said it to me, I would also have said that given the record of Iraq in the peninsula in the 1970s, and given the strategic concerns of Saudi Arabia when the Arab Cooperation Council was formed, I doubt that it is possible to legislate, so to speak, complete trust overnight with a non-aggression pact. But those two statements are absolutely accurate.
So you did not see Iraq at that time as a threat to Saudi Arabia or to the region?
At that time?
At that time. We're talking about 1989 here. I'm not trying to trap you with any of these questions. I just want to get the record clear with respect to this. Now, I understand while I was out of the room, Mr. Solars went into this Voice of America editorial.
He did.
And I had only a couple of questions about that. After that incident, were new procedures for advanced State Department clearance put in place for all editorials dealing with Iraq?
Mr. Hamilton, I think I know the answer to that question, but I'm going to decline to answer. That really is a question that I think has to go to the State Department. I was in Baghdad.
I see. You do know the answer to it.
I think I do, but I don't want to be wrong, so respectfully.
Well, we will submit that in writing,
yes,
and then the department
please.
can
that would be,
respond
if you would.
to it.
Yes.
Now I want to move on to February 21st, 1990. That day, the State Department Human Rights Report on Iraq came out, and it called the Iraqi record abysmal. You probably recall that.
We wrote it in my embassy, sir.
Okay. What was the reaction in Baghdad?
Oh, very hurt feelings, I would say.
Were you called to the Foreign Ministry?
I don't remember if I was specifically called to the Foreign Ministry or whether I was going anyway, but certainly within 1 or 2 days of the issuance of the report, I was told that in a rather informal way, actually, that it was unfair and so on and so on. And I said I would be delighted to give them extra copies.
Did they lodge a protest with us?
Not a formal protest to me. I don't recall if Ambassador Mashat did here. He may have, but not in Baghdad.
And do you know what response we made to their criticism of the report?
I made no response. I said our views stand as written, and I said, in fact, they were written in my embassy, so I certainly am not going to debate them.
When chemical weapons were used, and now I'm jumping a little backwards, I think they were used by the Iraqis in
September 88.
September 88, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did we lodge a protest at that time?
We not only lodged a protest.
Were you ambassador at that point?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
We not only lodged a protest, as I think I mentioned earlier in my testimony, that event, or our ability to detect that event, ushered in an extremely energetic period of about a month or even 6 weeks, I don't recall, of diplomacy and also activity. You remember that was the period when we had, I don't know how many tens of thousands of people marching past the embassy and so on.
And how did they respond to that protest? What did they say to you? We did it, or did they deny they did it?
They denied they did it initially. However, the president of Iraq then indicated in a series of televised remarks, as I recall, that they did, thereby pulling out the rug from those who had already planned another campaign. And this, you know, I had only been in Iraq for about 2 months then, Mr. Chairman, but it was quite a week because the defense minister, in an effort, I mean, it was a very illustrative moment for those of us new to Iraq. The defense minister, in an effort to diffuse Western criticism, made the following public statement. This is an effort to diffuse criticism. He said, for every insect, there's an insecticide.
All right, now I'm going to shift the time on you again, and I want to go to February 24th, 1990. Saddam Hussein gave a speech in Amman,
Yes.
Jordan. You're
Yes.
familiar with that.
Oh, yes.
Very tough speech. He called on Arab investors to pull money out of the United States, invest in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union instead. He protested the U.S. support for the new wave of Jewish immigration to Israel. He denounced our naval presence in the Persian Gulf, and then he said, and I quote him, "America is repeatedly saying its armed forces will remain in the region. This makes us wonder what was the real U.S. attitude toward ending the Iran-Iraq war, whether it really wanted it to end, period," end of quote.
Yes.
Now, 4 days after that, the State Department testifies before this subcommittee, and it says this, quote, "It is clear that Iraq seeks improved relations with the United States. Trade will be a key factor in that relationship. This is not an easy relationship, but it is an important one in which we have made significant progress in recent years," end of quote. Then I asked Secretary Kelly on that same day, February 28, 1990, about the speech, the speech of February the 24th, and Secretary Kelly said, and I quote him, "I must say that the tone of my conversations in Iraq was quite constructive and did not include strong criticisms of that type. I have asked the government of Iraq if they would care to explain these recent statements to us. We do not yet have a response," end of quote. Now, we then in this subcommittee read the speech of Saddam Hussein on February the 24th, and we believed it to be a major attack on the United States. And yet, the testimony of the department is that significant progress is being made in recent years, and that it is, and this is the sentence that really puzzles me, it is clear that Iraq seeks improved relations with the United States 4 days after a blistering attack against us. Now, how do I understand that? I mean, here, I'm trying to understand what's happening out there. And I get that kind of testimony after that kind of a speech, and I don't understand it.
The chronological event between Mr. Kelly's visit on the 12th of February, I believe, with Saddam Hussein, in which Saddam Hussein registered very clearly his desire for improved relations, as he had in the past. And the February 24th speech, what came in the middle was the VOA editorial, as you know, Mr. Chairman. When, in other words, he thought that he was being attacked. He thought that John Kelly had come, and I must say, is John Kelly, I remember very well, he said, "We are prepared," he said to Saddam Hussein, "to have good relations with you." He didn't go any further than that. And then he made clear, as I recall, that we had an agenda If there was going to be good relations, there were things that we wanted from them. And President Saddam had responded that he did indeed want a better relationship that he had with us. Neither side pretended that our relationship was good, but it had been abysmal, as you recall. And the speech on February 17, which occurred in Amman, in Baghdad, was then followed by the speech you're talking about in Amman on the 24th. It was almost immediately after the VOA speech that he changed his tune. It was actually before the 24th. The Amman summit of the ACC was on February the 24th. The foreign ministers had met about 4 days before in Baghdad, and he gave a preview of his speech in Baghdad. This was the second time we'd heard it. But we didn't, neither Mr. Kelly nor I knew about the VOA editorial.
Well, let me ask you, after that speech, was it your impression that Iraq was trying to improve relationships with the United States?
I certainly did not think so, and I was very puzzled. The Arab ambassadors had a meeting, I remember, after that speech, the day of that speech in Baghdad, and then came to see me and asked me if I could solve the mystery. And then they told me they thought it was the VOA editorial. But yes, of course, this is a serious change of tune from the Iraqis. I mean, the president of Iraq had said exactly the opposite a week before, so of course I was puzzled. I wanted to get to the bottom of it so that I could make some kind of recommendation to the department.
And you thought it was a major speech, I presume, and
of course I did.
Were worried by the tone of it and not just the tone, but the language of it.
So were the other Arab chiefs of state who didn't understand either.
Okay. Then I want to go next to April 1990, and on April the 2nd, and that was the occasion when Saddam Hussein, at a military ceremony, announced that Iraq had developed chemical weapons. And he said, and I quote him, "By God, we will make the fire eat up half of Israel if it tries to do anything against Iraq." End of quote. I'm sure you remember that. What did you then do after you heard that speech?
What I did, Mr. Chairman, was to say out loud to myself, thank God we have a diplomatic presence here, because it would appear that there is a diplomatic crisis in the offing.
And you protested the speech?
Oh, yes, of course.
Yes. To whom? Foreign minister, or do you remember?
To the foreign ministry, whoever I could see. I don't remember. I believe it was to Nizar Hamdoun, who was the deputy minister.
The deputy foreign
minister, yes. And of course, there was an immediate public reaction here.
Yes.
And I believe Ambassador Mashat was called in on the same day, as I recall.
How did the Iraqis respond to you? Do you recall when you protested?
I think they just, I'm trying to remember, if I don't believe there was any response at all initially. Other than to repeat a kind of a set of background points. And the litany is known to you.
Yes.
The belief, and the one basic point, of course, the Iraqi belief that the repetition of the 1981 attack could occur at any time. And they really were obviously concerned about it. It happened once, it could happen again. This, of course, was the excuse that was ultimately given to us, and as you know very well, we told them, and we didn't find that.
Yes. Now I want to direct your attention to April 12th of that year, and you had a group of U.S. senators in Baghdad. I'm not going to ask you about some of the quotes that were made. I'll overlook that, but during the Codel, Saddam Hussein reportedly backed off his statement that he would attack Israel saying he meant only that he would respond if attacked first.
Yes.
Is that your recollection of the conversation?
It's my recollection of the American media's understanding. In fact, on February the 24th, we read his speech as saying, the key sentence as beginning with "if."
If.
So we didn't hear a difference.
You interpreted that as if he was backing off his threat?
I'm sorry, April the 1st, I didn't mean February.
Yeah. Did you? The question was, did you interpret that?
No, we didn't. I mean, this is not enough. You can't. It's unacceptable and inflammatory to be talking about burning up half of Israel, no matter what the context. It was unacceptable, and we said so, and so did Senator Dole in his letter, which was published, as you recall.
All right. Now I want to go to April the 26th, 1990, and that's an event here, not in Baghdad.
That was my birthday. I was trying to remember what happened.
Okay. Well, this was the State Department testimony, again, on U.S.-Iraqi relationships. And just for our record here, it takes place with the State Department's human rights statement, abysmal human rights in Iraq, Saddam Hussein's February speech, highly critical of the United States, a murder attempt in February instigated by the Iraqi mission in New York, the execution in March of the journalist Bazoft, Iraq's efforts in March to smuggle nuclear capacitors, the triggering devices, out of the United States, the stationing in March of missile launchers in western Iraq, and the April 2nd statement that I referred to a moment ago against Israel.
Yes.
All of those events right in this period of time. And the testimony before this subcommittee is this. Mr. Kelly, quote, "Our policy toward Iraq has been to attempt to develop gradually a mutually beneficial relationship in order to strengthen positive trends in Iraq's foreign and domestic policies." End of quote. In response to a question on the evidence of change in Iraq, he says, quote, "One swallow does not make a spring. Nevertheless, we believe there is at least the possibility of improvement, and we want to try to encourage that improvement." End of quote. Then another quote. All of these are out of context, but I think they give an accurate flavor of the testimony we received. Quote, "The best way to improve Iraqi behavior was to try to engage with Iraq." End of quote. And then another quote. "We believe there is still a possibility for positive alterations in Iraqi behavior. We do not believe the imposition of economic sanctions now would leave that possibility open, period." End of quote. Now that's the quotations, the testimony that caused Mr. Lantos to say, as you'll recall earlier in his statement, that there was an Alice in Wonderland quality about the testimony of the State Department at that point. Now, what strikes me, of course, is that you have all of this evidence of increasingly ominous behavior by Iraq, but no change in policy. And statements before this subcommittee that do not in any way suggest the severity of Saddam Hussein's conduct. And so my question is here, why? I mean, why didn't we get here a sense of what Saddam Hussein was doing? and these outrageous speeches and actions. We didn't, and we get the reaction from the State Department that we got to gradually develop this mutually beneficial relationship.
Mr. Chairman, we didn't have any ongoing programs at that time government-to-government programs, except for our cultural center, which I'm sure you're not going to suggest we should have closed. the tone of our exchanges had gone to, I think I can use the word confrontational, months before that, certainly by the middle of February. I think I must have failed to convey my very profound belief that the more dangerous the situation, the tougher the situation, the more important it is to stay in there, try to maintain and improve, if possible, access to the host government decision makers, and do what can be done, and our reach should always exceed our grasp in these issues, because in the Middle East they usually are issues of peace and war, to ameliorate the tension. It has to be done.
May I ask you, during this period of time now, we're talking about the winter and the spring of 1990. Was it your feeling that Iraqi attitudes and actions were becoming increasingly worse from our point of view?
Of course, and I thought that they were based on a genuine Iraqi fear.
Now, why wasn't
paranoid, if you will.
Sure. Why wasn't that conveyed to us in testimony? I mean, that may not be a fair question to you because you were in Baghdad, but that simply was not conveyed to us.
Well, you know, you are telling me that Mr. Kelly was speaking about his meeting on the 12th. That was before any of these events. It was the last moment when we saw what we hoped would be a Saddam Hussein who was genuinely interested in finding concrete, tangible actions to take which would encourage us to believe that we could develop some real, I don't want to say trust, but sufficient confidence on which to establish a useful dialogue. But the point is, it seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that as the situation became tense, and it was very tense when Senator Dole and his group arrived, it was important that we were there, that he was willing to see us. Now, in the past, he wouldn't have been willing to see us. He wouldn't have been willing to listen. We were making, Western diplomacy, certainly not the Americans, Western diplomacy was beginning to make some inroads in our ability to talk to Iraqi policymakers, and that is important.
I do not mean to suggest, of course, by my question that I favored breaking off diplomatic relations with Iraq. I agree with your statement. It was important. That's one of the very essential features of diplomacy, to sense that kind of a change and to convey it. What bothers me is, if I understand your reactions here, is that while you were analyzing this as a period, as you said a moment ago, of great tension and increasingly worse relations between the two countries, the testimony here in Washington did not convey that sense at all. Now, well, I don't hold you responsible for that.
Well, I don't want to distance myself from the testimony. There was one sentence that I didn't recall, but the other points that you read seemed to me, in the limited context of short, assertive sentences, yes, to be true, and not at all to be contradictory to the concern that obviously the whole world felt as these comments about binary chemical weapons were repeated and repeated.
Now let me go on. I'm pushing on with some other events here. This one, May 28th and 30th, 1990, there was an Arab League summit that was held in Baghdad. And at the instigation of Iraq, the summit's communique contained a number of references that were very critical of the United States and of U.S. policy, including a statement holding the United States, quote, primarily responsible, end of quote, for the situation in the region. The
Yes.
summit denounced the
That's right.
influx of Soviet Jews to Israel. It contained very inflammatory threats
Yes.
against Israel. Now, did you protest that speech? What happened as a result of that speech? Do you recall? What did you do?
Well, there were two or three things that happened. There was a communique that I think is what you were excerpting there. There was an alleged secret conclave of the chiefs of state, which I knew nothing about at the time, and I don't even know existed. It is said now that it happened and that the Emir of Kuwait was threatened. This we didn't know about, and I don't know that it happened. The communique, of course, in the normal course of diplomatic discourse, I told the Foreign Ministry exactly how objectionable we found that. Of course, the Iraqis would have pointed out that this was not simply their view; it was the view of all the chiefs of state. While our moderate friends, of course, said you should have seen the first draft, as they always do.
Did our policy change in any way toward Iraq in response to the communique, the outcome of the Baghdad summit? Did we shift our policy at all?
Mr. Chairman, our policy towards Iraq was never more than a cautious inching forward when we thought the Iraqis deserved a positive quid pro quo from us. There was no program by that time to discontinue. We were existing solely on the basis of a diplomatic dialogue. That was it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I think we were not using any carrots. We didn't have any in our pocket. I spent every day going down and swinging at them with the same kind of adjectives that they were using in their communiques.
Well, let me convey to you my impression, and you don't need to respond to this at all if you don't want to. But as I look at this record now, and obviously I'm not privy to all that goes on here, but I get the impression that no one in the high levels of policy making in the State Department was paying very much attention to Iraq until probably about the end of July of 1990. In other words, what I'm saying to you is I get the very clear impression that during these 6 or 8 months prior to August the 2nd, Iraq's policy changed, and it changed in a very negative way towards the United States. But U.S. policy did not change. That the warning bells went off, but nobody in Washington was listening. And the question I have on my mind then is why policy didn't change during this time. And that's probably not a question to put to you, but I want you to understand why I, and I think some of the other members of the subcommittee feel as we do.
May I just say very quickly, Mr. Chairman, that the relationship that we had by March or April was a very flimsy one. The flavor became more and more sour. When you say our policy didn't change, I would simply like to reiterate that our policy was to be there, to see if we could not influence the Iraqis in a positive way, and that's what we continue to do. The idea, Mr. Chairman, that a speech about incinerating half of Israel, which caused weeks of great concern and high tension in the area, didn't have the primary attention of the Secretary of State and the President of the United States, seems to me Alice in Wonderland. It really does. I wasn't here, but I feel absolutely confident that the highest levels of the American government was as concerned as everybody else in the world when we learned that missiles had been moved to western Iraq and pointed at Israel. So with the greatest of respect, Mr. Chairman, I really must ask that you reconsider the notion that in the summer and spring of any time after April the 1st, that the events in the Middle East and Iraq's belligerent attitude did not have high-level attention. And I really reject the notion that our policy didn't change. Our policy, if I may say for the third time, was simply to be there, to do what we could. We originally were thinking in terms of carrots and sticks. We had no carrots on the table and none in our pocket. We were using sticks. And we were helpful, Mr. Chairman. We helped to reduce the tension between Israel and Iraq, as I believe the Israelis said.
While you're telling me that our policy was to be there, Mr. Kelly is telling me our policy toward Iraq has been to attempt to develop gradually mutually beneficial relationships.
Absolutely. I couldn't have put it better.
Positive trends.
Indeed, that's just what I said. In order, when we could, if we could draw out some positive trends, and we did get a few things along the way, Mr. Chairman. I want to say that again.
Why didn't Mr. Kelly convey to us this sense of deterioration in the relationship? That's the key point.
When was this? I'm sorry.
Well, April 26th, and then again in July.
Well,
let's see, I'm not sure the date.
Well, no, all right, April 26th.
April and July are the two dates.
Well, I mean, honestly, Mr. Chairman, this is right after this extraordinary speech of Saddam's of April the 1st, publicized first on April the 2nd. I mean, I don't know anything about this exchange between you and Mr. Kelly, but it seems to me perfectly fair to assume that the tension in the Middle East would be well known in this committee, and of course that's presumably why you were asking him these questions. But I think the sentence you just read absolutely encapsulates what we were trying to do. If it was impossible at a certain period to pull out any positive threads from this relationship, then the best we could do was to be there and make sure that we did what we could to lower the tension and hope that we would be able to influence Iraq in the future along positive lines. And as I say, there were a few things that we were able to get along the way. You know, it was in January, sir, that the travel ban of so many years was lifted. And it was lifted for all Iraqis.
All right, now I want to go to July the 15th. And at that point, the foreign minister, Mr. Aziz, is writing a threatening letter to the Arab League, accusing Kuwait and the UAE of direct aggression by exceeding their oil production quotas. And then on July the 17th, Saddam accused the Gulf Arab states of stabbing Iraq in the back with a poisoned dagger by overproducing oil, and saying something effective must be done. Did that speech come as a big surprise to you, or had you picked up earlier than that signals that this tough line toward Kuwait was emerging?
Oh, it was a very public emergence, and ironically, the tough line before that was being taken by the Saudis and the Iraqis in tandem. There were a series of meetings and highly publicized messages amongst the OPEC countries in preparation for the July 25th OPEC meeting. There was a meeting of a group of Arab OPEC members in Jeddah well prior to the 15th.
Did you meet with Aziz after these speeches I referred to, or
I met with Tariq Aziz on July the 28th.
So that was after his speech and after Saddam's speech on July 17th.
Yes.
And
but as I pointed out, starting on the 18th, with the exception only of an intervening Friday, which of course is the day that the Iraqi Foreign Ministry is closed, starting on the 18th, I was there every day and 3 times on the 25th.
Yeah, this was during a period when you were seeking daily clarifications and explanations.
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Yes, it is, sir.
We have often heard here that the foreign minister was isolated from Saddam Hussein. He was not really on the inner circle. What is your impression of that?
I'm always fascinated by people who pontificate about the inner workings of the Iraqi government. I can say that after 2 years, I have no good idea about who Saddam Hussein's close advisors are. And, Mr. Chairman, it was not for lack of trying, I can tell you. But I do not know. I believe, and I am speculating, not informing you, that Saddam Hussein recognized that he had very, very few people to whom he could turn, loyal Ba'athis who had experience and knowledge of the West. And I think he would number 2 of his 3 deputy prime ministers as perhaps 1 and 2 of only 4 or 5 such people. One of those, of course, is Tariq Aziz.
What letter are we referring to here? Who wrote that? Now, you met with Hamdoun, Nizar Hamdoun, on the 25th. Am I correct about that?
Twice.
Of July. You met with him twice on that day. Did you at that time have instructions regarding, did you have instructions regarding clarifications on that July 16th letter to the Arab League and the July 17th Saddam
I had those
speech?
Instructions on the 18th of July, sir.
Had no instructions?
I had them on the 18th of July. They were immediately sent to, not just to me, but all of my colleagues in the area.
Was there any subsequent instructions after July 18th and before this July 15th?
There was no need for any further formal instructions, sir. What we did have was the equivalent of additional instructions in the State Department's public statement on the 24th. And it was those remarks by Ms. Tutwiler that caused me to be summoned at midnight, and then some hours later I received the text from Washington, and that was the occasion of my unannounced arrival at the Foreign Ministry later in the morning to deliver those in writing.
All right, and you went to the presidency to see Saddam. Is that correct, on the 25th?
I was taken to the presidency. I didn't have the slightest idea who I would see. There are a number of people whose offices are in the presidency. I was put into a presidency car, and nobody knew that I was going, except happily the Italian ambassador. I said, please come and get me if you don't know.
And you met with Saddam at that point?
Yes, indeed, he was there. Mm-hmm.
Now, during that meeting, did he say specifically he would not use force or invade Kuwait?
Yes.
And that was not a conditional statement of any kind. It was just a flat, clear, plain statement. We will not invade Kuwait. Is that correct?
The Iraqis are prone to what a colleague of mine yesterday called loony legalisms. Saddam Hussein told me he would not use violence to settle his disputes. I believe that the way the transcript was issued, with those comments at the end of it from Saddam Hussein, were intended to make the point that you're inferring, that what he told me was, as long as the Kuwaitis do the right thing, we won't invade. That is not the case at all. As President Mubarak announced, was told to him, and as I read in the open letter that King Fahd has, the Saudi embassy here has published from King Fahd to President Saddam Hussein. King Fahd is very clear.
So it's a very clear.
There is no question
no
about it.
conditionality to the.
Certainly not.
All right.
And as I said, repeated to me by two different ministers on the 28th and the 29th.
Was one of those ministers Hassan Kamal?
Yes, indeed, on the 29th.
And he said to you flatly, we are not going to use the troops.
As I told you, he asked me to come in, said, don't worry about the troops. We've already told you, now I want to talk to you about a commercial issue.
Okay. I wanted to check on a quote that was attributed to you in the New York Times in a September article, which you said, quote, in the paper, obviously I didn't think, and nobody else did, that the Iraqis were going to take all of Kuwait, end of quote.
Or any of it.
Or, okay, that's the point I wanted to make.
I probably didn't say it, Mr. Chairman, but that's what I meant, and it will serve me right for...
Well, the phrase all of, you didn't expect they were going to take any part of it.
No, I did not, sir.
Okay,
but I would like to add something to that.
Yeah.
I hope I've explained to the committee very clearly why I didn't think that they were going to take all of it. And in summary, because they were already getting what they wanted. Why do it? But they're a completely different point, in which I was not discussing when I talked in the New York Times, and I think it is important, is that since Iraq for so many years had tried to make its point, which were always bullying points with Kuwait, by brief incursions, I think that early on in this crisis, a number of the Arab states thought that that's what they were looking at, the beginning of another brief incursion. I don't know how many brief incursions the Iraqis have made into Kuwait. I doubt the American government knows, but there have been many of them over the last 30 years.
Now, at what point did you think Iraq was going to invade Kuwait? When did you first think that?
I didn't, Mr. Chairman, if I had thought Iraq was going to invade Kuwait, I would have asked the President to cancel my instructions and allow me to stay at post. I knew Iraq was going to invade Kuwait when I saw pictures on the BBC in London on the morning of the 2nd as I was packing to come home.
So until the actual invasion, it was your view that they would not invade Kuwait?
Absolutely, sir.
Yeah. And you left Baghdad for London on what date? Do you recall?
30th of July.
Were you leaving at that time for a policy review?
Yes, sir.
To take
My
place?
orders read 10 days consultation.
You were coming to Washington or to London?
To Washington.
And had we concluded at that point that no invasion would occur?
Absolutely, sir. That's why we were going to. Now let me be careful here. We thought that the immediate crisis was over. This man having told everybody on the map practically that it was, and we calculating incorrectly that it was in his interest that it be over, since he was going to get what he wanted, and if he invaded, to our logic, he would be committing some kind of suicide. So we thought the immediate crisis was over. I certainly don't want to imply that we thought everything was going to be hunky-dory, or that the negotiations with Kuwait were going to be swift and easy. Of course we didn't. But we did not think he was going to invade Kuwait. I
understand. You were quoted, I think, yesterday as saying that you thought Saddam Hussein was stupid.
Suicidal, I mean, yes.
When did you reach the conclusion he was stupid?
When he invaded Kuwait, sir.
During the time that you spoke to him, did you think he was stupid?
No, I thought he was ignorant.
Thought he was what?
Ignorant. And, yes.
Ignorant about what?
About the United States, about our values, about our power.
During your tour then, and as you got to know this man, you felt he, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I want to get a sense of it, you felt he was out of touch, out out of reach. Did you feel that way about him?
Yes, and this is what I had been told before I went to Iraq, and that is why I directed my staff to assist me in doing two things, trying to do two things, keeping two goals before us, that we should constantly think of ways in which we could expose him and other senior decision makers to all those things about us, our values, our policies, and the intricacies of our constitutional structures, the relationship between the Congress and the media and the government and the Supreme Court, all of which are totally misunderstood by Iraqi decision makers. And I mentioned the one obvious way seemed to be to try to get journalists in to see him. The other thing that we set ourselves to do was to see if we could find any way to get in to see him. And we couldn't. I would just like to add one other comment, if I may, because it was such a major focus of our embassy. We wanted to try to break through this iron curtain that Saddam had put around the people of Iraq, and which was complete. Of course, foreigners couldn't go to an Iraqi house and vice versa, and anybody who was unwise enough to talk to us would, of course, be interrogated by the police and so on. So we did set up a cultural people-to-people program, and I like to think that that is what we did leave behind in 2 years. We touched a lot of people, hundreds and hundreds of people, and that is what we need, sir, I think, in Iraq.
So you didn't think Saddam Hussein was stupid when you talked with him, but you thought he was ignorant of the United States and not in touch with a lot of reality, I guess.
And badly advised, or sycophantically advised, if I...
Mr. McCloskey, we'll try to wrap it up here quickly. Mr. McCloskey, I think, has a few questions.
Thank you so much, again, Ms. Glaspie, and I'll be very brief. First of all, I'd just like to note that when I asked you to comment and advise as to present status and of concerns and future prospects in Kuwait, and particularly Iraq, you very graciously deferred to the Secretary of State. I understand that, but I do hope we have the opportunity for your counsel on these very major developments at some time in the near future, if we could work that out with you and the Secretary. And I realize I probably went on and on about our difference in substance and semantics on the democratic aspects of Kuwait, but I guess we could say it's a relatively benevolent or more or less progressive monarchy with some democratic aspects. Could that get us closer to...
Well, Mr. McCloskey, it's the only country that I've had the pleasure serving in, other than this one and the United Kingdom, which had a parliament. I used to go to it twice a week, and it was... You wouldn't have allowed the freewheeling conversation that they allowed. Unfortunately, there's no parliament now.
Yeah, I get it. There's also questions about rights of parliaments and powers of parliaments, but I really don't want to go on and on about that. But Saddam Hussein took Kuwait in 6 hours, about. Is that not correct? That was...
However long it took to drive to the borders.
Yeah, pretty stark and pretty simple. Did you? And I guess about that time you were somewhere between London and Washington, or
yes. Well, I was
in transit.
I was in London and was ordered to stay there for 2 or 3 days.
Now, did you think at that time that Saddam Hussein would go into Saudi Arabia?
I had, well, I couldn't decide. In my mind, it was when I came back here and was able to look at the information that we had that I understood why the president had.
Well, when you looked at that information, it must have been at least on the 3rd or something like that. Did you advise the president or the secretary then on
well, I didn't get back until the 8th.
Well, somewhere, okay, communications being what they are, did you advise the president as to likely Iraqi intentions on Saudi Arabia?
No, sir. I mean, I was isolated from information where I was.
Okay. Now, and then you could not advise at all then by the implications of what you're saying, or you did not as to whether or not to deploy troops.
No, but as soon as I got back, I offered my advice.
And could I ask what that was?
No, sir.
Well, I'm asking, I guess I can't ask, but you're saying you decline to answer.
Well, could you ask me precisely the question again? What issue it was that you were asked, that I advise on?
Did you advise? Did you have an opinion, or did you advise the president or the secretary on deploying troops to Saudi Arabia?
No, I did not. Those decisions. No, I did not.
You did not. You did not.
I did not advise the president. No.
Were you? How about the secretary?
Or the secretary? No.
Well, in effect, you're not in the loop for all your activity on.
I wouldn't expect to be, sir. I mean, this is they would ask my advice on matters having to do directly with Iraq. This would be a major political, military question, which I would not expect to be asked for advice on, or in fact, any ambassador.
So did you think it was was your immediate reaction that it was a wise thing at
Yes,
the time
sir.
to deploy the troops, which most of us did agree with?
Yes, sir.
Quite frankly. Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. You've been very generous, Ms. Glaspie, and I hope I see you again.
Mr. Burton.
Thank you very much. I know you're very tired, and I've been gone and come back, and we won't keep you but just for a moment. You've been very patient. There was a question that was asked earlier about did you tell Saddam Hussein that the VOA editorial in February of 1990, which mentioned Iraq among countries with a secret police, was sad, and did you reassure him by stating that a formal apology was presented? And as I understand it, you answered in the affirmative, but said that that VOA broadcast was cleared only for Eastern Europe. Is that correct?
No, sir. None of that is correct. All those details were between me and the Foreign Ministry in late February. What happened with Saddam Hussein was that he referred to it in his rather long opening remarks to me, and in passing later on in the conversation, I referred to it and reminded him, since he seemed to think that we had done nothing about it, I reminded him that the foreign minister had already received a letter from us on that subject. I wanted to be sure that the foreign minister had told him of the exchange between us. That's why I raised it.
But did you object to that, or did you apologize for that VOA editorial?
I wrote a letter on instructions from the department using the words which were carefully crafted in the department, which were along the lines of, and you probably have the text in front of you, that the editorial could have given rise to misinterpretation. Yes, I did indeed.
Well,
but that was months before.
Mr. Solars, according to my staff assistant, indicated that you indicated to him that when he asked about this, this editorial was cleared for Eastern Europe only.
No, I discussed that point with the foreign ministry in February. I didn't discuss that with Saddam Hussein. It was a passing remark in the Saddam Hussein conversation. I might have. I mean, if it had occurred to me to say so, I might have, but there's no reason to say so, and I didn't say so.
You did not say it was cleared only for Eastern
Europe?
No,
but it's true. It was cleared for broadcast in Eastern Europe. Your remark is correct.
It was cleared only for broadcast in Eastern Europe?
That's correct. And then the last lines were then added. It was translated into Arabic and broadcast with the additional language, but uncleared for broadcast in Arabic or with the additional language.
Well, we contacted the VOA, and they said that it was not limited to Eastern Europe only. It was
well, good, but it was written, I was informed, for Eastern European audience. Certainly, when you read the text of it, that is where it is directed. But the point about the clearance of the editorial is that basically the editorial was used twice. It was used, and then a final short paragraph was added. And that amended version was not re-cleared in the State Department.
Well, I won't prolong this. I submitted earlier some questions for the record, and the chairman very graciously said that you would answer those for us.
With pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And just finally, Madam Ambassador, as you look back over your experience there, what would you have done differently in light of subsequent events with respect to your own conduct and with respect to U.S. policy?
I have, of course, been over this in my mind many times. I have discussed it with people whose knowledge of Iraq is greater than mine and whose views I respect. Given the fact, and it was a fact, that we overestimated Saddam Hussein's instinct for self-preservation, for whatever reasons, I think that what we did was internally consistent, and our mistake, and this is what I would change if I could, but with the data available to me at the time, I do not believe that I would have come to a different conclusion, no matter how hard I thought about it. We did not realize he would be so foolish as to ignore our repeated and crystal clear warnings. So with the data available to us, I fear that I could only have come to the wrong conclusion. I don't take comfort that everybody else that I was working with in Baghdad, including the Arab ambassadors, came to that same wrong conclusion.
So looking back then, you really see no mistakes?
I think it was morally right to, in August 1988, try to see if we could bring him along. We never bought the line that, I think you know, Mr. Chairman, was propagated in the area that this is a changed man. We can work with him. That is not the attitude with which we began this experiment in August 1988. We hoped he might be a changed man. We hoped very much he might be a changed man. And if he wasn't, we hoped that we could change him.
So I just want to be clear, as you look back, you see no mistakes.
I can only speak to the approach that we took. If you want to go hour by hour and day by day, I'm sure we made many mistakes. I'm talking about, which seems to me the fair question, if I may say, Mr. Chairman, the approach that we took.
The policy was
the
right.
Policy approach that we took, not the day-by-day execution. My goodness, I'm sure I made many mistakes. But the approach, I think, was right. And we failed. We didn't make it work.
And by the word approach, you really mean the policy?
Yes, the general overall policy, yes.
Well, we've had you here a very, very long time, and I apologize to you for that. You've been very patient with us in responding to our questions. And after a good many weeks and months in which we've sought the opportunity to have you, we're very pleased that you could come. The subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
On Wednesday, former Ambassador Glaspie testified on the other side of Capitol Hill before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and her appearance before that panel will be seen again on Sunday at 10:25 a.m. Eastern Time, 7:25 a.m. Pacific Time. Up next, it's a hearing on the organization of the intelligence community.